Leo Tolstoy appeared to have grasped everything humanity chases after. Born into the Russian aristocracy, he inherited wealth that shielded him from the struggles of the common man. Recognition followed his every step, a crown forged by his towering literary achievements. A loving family surrounded him with warmth and devotion, and his legacy was already cemented in the annals of history. His novels, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, stood as colossi of art, masterpieces devoured by readers across continents, dissected by intellectuals, and celebrated as some of the greatest works ever penned. At the zenith of his success, Tolstoy's name was a beacon of prestige, whispered with awe in salons and lecture halls alike. Yet, beneath this shimmering surface, a shadow began to spread. A question took root in his mind, faint at first, then deafening. If death consumes all, what is the meaning of life? This wasn't a fleeting philosophical musing. It was an existential rupture that tore through the fabric of his being. Each morning, Tolstoy rose not to the glow of his triumphs, but to a silent, gnawing dread, the certainty that death would erase everything he'd built. His novels, his family's love, his name, stalked him like a relentless phantom. He likened life to a lost traveler stumbling through a boundless wilderness, hunted by an inescapable beast, death, while clutching at brittle reeds above a fathomless abyss. His wealth, his fame, his literary laurels offered no armor. Instead, they honed the edge of his torment. The more he achieved, the deeper the void yawned within him. How could a man who possessed everything feel as though he had nothing at all? What was the worth of his creations, his bonds, his legacy, if they were doomed to vanish into oblivion? This wasn't merely Tolstoy's private anguish. It was a quiet terror that echoed in the hearts of countless others who, having scaled life's summits, found themselves gazing into an emptiness they couldn't name. Desperate for a lifeline, Tolstoy turned to the tools that had always guided him: intellect, inquiry, and the power of the written word. He immersed himself in the works of poets like Goethe, whose verses danced with human longing, historians like Gibbon, who traced the arcs of empires from rise to ruin, and rationalists like Voltaire, whose piercing logic cut through superstition. He pored over their pages, seeking a thread of wisdom to stitch his fractured spirit back together, a light to pierce the darkness that engulfed him. But the deeper he ventured, the more his despair thickened. Poetry painted life's beauty and sorrow in vivid strokes, yet left him unmoored, drifting without a shore. History unfurled humanity's endless cycles of triumph and collapse, its victories and defeats, but revealed no enduring purpose to cling to. Reason sliced existence into frigid mechanical pieces, cause and effect, birth and decay, but offered no warmth, no solace. The question loomed larger, unyielding, a specter that mocked his every effort. Why live if everything ends? This crisis drove him to a brutal precipice. Reason, his lifelong companion, laid bare two stark paths, each as unforgiving as the last. He could accept life as a hollow charade, a meaningless procession of days to be endured in mute resignation, a shadow of the vibrant soul he'd once been. Or he could end it entirely, silencing the unbearable riddle with a final, irrevocable act. In his rawest confessions, Tolstoy admitted to hiding knives from his own sight, shunning solitude lest his hands betray him, avoiding the woods where a single rope could end his torment. This wasn't melodrama. It was the jagged endpoint of a mind that saw no rational escape from the abyss. If every joy, every triumph, every tender bond dissolved into nothingness, what purpose could possibly remain? He wrestled with this logic, its weight pressing down on him like a stone, crushing the breath from his chest. Yet, Even as despair tightened its coils, a faint ember of resistance flickered within. He couldn't fully surrender to the idea that life's light was a cruel trick, a flame that burned only to gutter out. So, Tolstoy shifted his search. He turned away from the polished world of the elite, those who mirrored his own restlessness, their lives a veneer of confidence over a shared disquiet, and looked instead to the margins of existence. He began to observe merchants haggling in dusty bazaars, their voices rising over the clatter of coins, soldiers trudging through mud and blood, their faces etched with weariness and resolve, wanderers carving paths through uncharted wilds, their steps guided by instinct rather than maps. These were people stripped of the comforts he had known, no grand estates to retreat to, no volumes bearing their names, no crowds to sing their praises. By all measures, their lives should have been bleaker than his own. They toiled beneath unforgiving suns, bore loss with calloused hands, and faced death without ceremony or fanfare. Yet they moved through the world with a resilience that stopped him cold. They laughed over meager meals shared in flickering lamplight, wept without shame at gravesides, built lives not from lofty ideals, but from raw necessity and unyielding will. What secret did they hold that he, with all his learning, could not grasp? Unlike the thinkers he'd studied, these people didn't chase meaning through endless debate or abstract theory. They didn't dissect existence into fragments or demand proof of its worth. They lived it, fully and without hesitation. A merchant found purpose in the rhythm of trade, the clink of coins a small victory, the trust of his customers a quiet bond. A soldier carved meaning from loyalty to his comrades, however fleeting their cause, standing watch through nights of frost and fire, his duty a shield against the dark. A wanderer drew strength from the horizon, each step a quiet defiance of despair, each dawn a testament to survival. They didn't ask whether life mattered, they acted as if it did, their days a living testament to an unspoken creed. Tolstoy watched, transfixed, as they faced hardship, grief, and the specter of death, not with terror, but with a steady endurance he lacked. Some spoke of gods or destiny, their voices low and certain. Others simply trusted the world's pulse and rhythm older than words. Their lives were unglamorous, often brutal, yet whole in a way his had never been. This realization seeped into him slowly, not as a sudden flare of insight, but as a rising tide that reshaped his shores. He had sought meaning in exalted realms, literature, acclaim, the labyrinth of thought, when it shimmered in the mundane, in the dust and sweat of ordinary days. Meaning wasn't a trophy to be claimed through argument. It was a gift unwrapped through living, a quiet truth revealed in action rather than words. These people didn't need to solve life's mysteries. They embraced them, their arms open to the unknown. They found joy in a day's labor, solace in a shared tale told over a fire, purpose in the hands they clasped in times of need. Tolstoy began to see his error. He demanded an eternal, unassailable truth, a fortress of certainty to stand against death's advance, when perhaps truth was softer, woven into the fabric of small, fleeting acts. His despair had stemmed from a hunger for absolute answers, but they thrived in mystery, their lives a quiet rebuttal to his anguish. This insight didn't erase his questions, it reframed them, turned them from burdens into possibilities. If meaning lay not in grand, final answers, but in lived moments, what did that mean for him? For years, he'd chased immortality through his pen, believing his words could defy time's erasure, that his novels could stand as bulwarks against oblivion. Now he doubted that pursuit, his faith in it shaken. His works, his fame, his legacy. Were they just fragile idols, destined to crumble like all else under the weight of years? He began to question the values that had defined him, the hunger for recognition that had driven him to write, the pride of intellect that had fueled his debates, the cushion of wealth that had softened his days. Slowly he turned toward a humbler path, one less traveled by men of his station. He sought out those he'd once ignored, sitting with traders in their cluttered stalls, listening to soldiers recount their scars in gruff, halting tones, walking beside wanderers under vast, unjudging skies. He shed his nobleman's silks for rough, unadorned cloth, not as a performance, but as a shedding of pretense, a step towards something real. Meaning, he realized, didn't demand brilliance or grandeur. It asked for presence, for a willingness to stand in the world as it was. But Tolstoy's journey was far from over. If the trappings of success had failed him, if the glittering promises of wealth and fame had proven hollow, what was worth seeking? He wrestled with this as he moved among these people, their lives a mosaic of grit and grace, a tapestry woven from struggle and quiet triumph. He began to suspect that purpose lay not in personal glory, not in the accumulation of accolades or the carving of one's name into history's stone, but in connection to others, to the earth, to a quiet sense of duty that needed no applause. His later writings took on a new weight, shifting from the sprawling epics of his youth to stark, piercing meditations on existence and morality. He clashed with the establishment, critics who prized his old grandeur and scorned his turn, nobles who sneered at his rejection of their world, institutions that clung to power with brittle hands, rejecting their polished truths for something rawer, something truer. He no longer saw life as a canvas for his own greatness, a stage for his singular brilliance, but as a shared story, fragile yet fierce, its meaning found in the threads that bound it together, in the lives that touched his own. At first glance, Tolstoy's early life gleamed with the promise of fulfillment. Born to privilege, he rose to become a literary titan, his works devoured across Europe and beyond, his name a currency of respect in the drawing rooms of the powerful and the lecture halls of the learned. His wealth cushioned him from the harshness of want. His ideas rippled through politics and culture, shaping discourse far beyond the page. If anyone had cause to feel complete, to rest in the glow of a life well lived, it was him. Yet beneath this radiant surface, he was unraveling thread by thread. Success rang hollow, a distant echo that faded the moment he reached for it. His triumph slipped through his fingers like sand, leaving nothing to hold. He compared himself to a man chasing a mirage across a desert waste, expecting an oasis of peace only to find barren ground stretching endlessly before him. His legacy, his influence, his family's love, none of it answered the question that shadowed him, a question that grew louder with each passing day. Why does any of this matter if death claims it all? This wasn't his burden alone. He saw it in others, mirrored in the faces of those around him. The poets who drowned their doubts in wine, their laughter brittle and forced, the nobles who masked their weariness with excess, their lives a cycle of indulgence and ennui, the scholars who boasted knowledge yet found no joy in their endless discoveries. Society preached that achievement brought peace, that the next milestone, the next victory, the next burst of applause would finally deliver fulfillment. But Tolstoy found only echoes, a chorus of empty promises that mocked his longing. His crisis forced him to confront a bitter possibility. Perhaps the goals we're taught to chase, status, acclaim, power, were the wrong ones, illusions dressed up as truths. Determined to unearth something real, something solid to stand on, he looked beyond his world, beyond the libraries and grand halls where he'd sought answers, to the lives of those who lived without illusion, who faced the raw edge of existence with neither fanfare nor fear. He studied humanity's boldest endeavors, art, war, governance, searching for a strand of purpose to cling to, a lifeline to pull him from the depths. Art captured fleeting beauty in paint and song, its colors vivid yet doomed to peel and fade with time. War forged empires of blood and iron, their banners raised in triumph, only to see them rust and collapse into dust. Governance tamed chaos with laws and order, building cities and systems to hold the world together, but couldn't explain why the chaos existed at all, why the world turned as it did. Even the grandest creations, cathedrals that pierced the heavens, treaties that bound nations, symphonies that stirred souls, crumbled under time's relentless weight. If civilization's peaks offered no solace, no anchor, where could he turn? It was then that he found clarity in the shadows of life, among those who moved through the world without applause. Traders bartering for survival in crowded markets, caregivers tending to the broken with gentle hands, drifters seeking the next horizon with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They didn't conquer despair with genius or grandeur. They outlasted it with heart, with a quiet, unyielding strength. Tolstoy's early despair had been a private storm, a tempest that raged within the walls of his mind, but it mirrored a broader human ache, a longing that stretched beyond his own soul. He saw it in the eyes of his peers. Writers who'd won immortality with their words, yet trembled at the sight of their next blank page, their pens shaking with the fear of inadequacy. Aristocrats who owned vast lands and titles, yet drifted in restless boredom, their days a blur of excess and emptiness. Thinkers who prided themselves on insight, who built elaborate systems of thought, yet found no peace in their endless discoveries, no joy in the truths they uncovered. These were people who'd grasped everything society deemed precious: money, status, admiration, yet wandered as if seeking something they couldn't name, something just beyond their reach. The most chilling truth was that many had stopped searching altogether. They'd accepted their emptiness as life's natural state, resigning themselves to a quiet, joyless drift, a life lived in shadow. Tolstoy couldn't follow them there. He refused to believe that existence was just a masquerade, a hollow performance with no depth, that the only choices were distraction or surrender. If meaning eluded the world of success, if it hid from the grasp of wealth and intellect, it had to dwell elsewhere. He would find it. So he pressed deeper, beyond his class, beyond the illusions of privilege that had once defined him. He turned to the working world, those who labored in markets, who marched in ranks, who roamed without roots. These were people who, by all logic, should have been more broken than he was. They had no cushions of wealth to soften their falls, no laurels to rest on, no promises of remembrance to comfort them. Their days were marked by sweat and struggle, their nights by uncertainty and the howl of the wind. Yet something set them apart, something undeniable. They weren't consumed by the dread that gnawed at him, that woke him in the night with its cold fingers around his throat. They didn't rise each morning in terror at death's approach or question their purpose with his relentless, agonizing doubt. Instead, they lived with a quiet strength, a deep-seated calm that eluded the brightest minds of his age, the most celebrated souls of his generation. The contrast struck him like a blow, a revelation that demanded his attention. Why did the privileged and learned drown in despair, while those with the least carried themselves with certainty, with a peace he could barely comprehend? At first, he wondered if their simplicity was ignorance, a shield born of unexamined lives, a refusal to look into the abyss. But the longer he watched, the clearer it became. Their peace wasn't a lack of thought, but a wisdom deeper than any he'd found in the dusty tomes of his library. He immersed himself in their world, walking beside merchants as they haggled over scraps in the clamor of the market, sitting with soldiers by flickering fires as they traded tales of battle and loss, listening to wanderers recount their trails through storm and silence, their voices rough with the weight of miles. These people live by an unspoken creed, not scrawled in books or debated in halls, but etched in the rhythms of their daily existence. They didn't agonize over meaning because it was woven into their actions. Duty to a trade that kept them alive, loyalty to a band that shared their burdens, love for a fleeting moment that made the struggle bearable. A merchant didn't ask if life mattered. He counted his wares, fed his kin, and rose again the next day. A soldier didn't debate existence. He stood watch, shared bread, and held the line. A wanderer didn't seek eternity. He sought the next dawn, the next bend in the road. Their strength fascinated him further, drew him in like a moth to a flame. Almost without exception, they leaned on something beyond themselves. Not always gods, but a trust in life's flow, an instinct that carried them forward. Some invoked fate, their words a quiet prayer to the unseen. Others spoke of the earth's cycles, the turn of seasons that promised renewal. Others still held a vague sense of order amid the chaos, a belief that the world moved with purpose even if they couldn't name it. They didn't see themselves as lone figures battling a void, solitary warriors against an indifferent universe. They were threads in a larger weave, tied to their kin, their work, their world. Tolstoy had once scoffed at such notions, dismissing them as crutches for the unthinking, relics of a simpler age. Now he saw them differently, saw them with new eyes. These people didn't cling to belief as an escape from reality. They used it as a root, an anchor that held them steady when the storms came. It gave them a resilience no argument had ever lent him, a steadiness he'd never known. They didn't fear death as he did. They faced it as part of the journey, a step rather than an end, a passage rather than a theft. This shook him to his core, rattled the foundations of everything he'd built his life upon. Could it be that the answers he'd sought in reason's cold, unyielding light lay instead in this quiet trust, this unspoken faith in life itself? He'd always believed understanding demanded rigor, logic, proof, clarity, the sharp edges of thought honed to perfection. Now he glimpsed another knowledge, one that couldn't be pinned to a page, couldn't be dissected in a debate or captured in a book. It was lived, breathed, felt, a wisdom that pulsed in the blood, not the mind. These people had shown him a truth he'd long ignored, a truth he'd turned away from in his pride. Meaning wasn't a riddle to be cracked, a puzzle to be solved with the right formula. It emerged when one surrendered to life, not wrestled it into submission. It bloomed not in endless questions, but in purposeful acts, in bonds forged through shared struggle, in the courage to keep going when all seemed lost. Tolstoy's crisis had dragged him to the edge of despair, teetering on the brink of a darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. But in these unassuming lives, in the merchants and soldiers and wanderers he'd once overlooked, he found a flicker of hope, not the fleeting kind born of distractions or fleeting pleasures, but a steady glow that let them rise each day, even amid pain, even amid loss. He began to see that the meaning of life might not hide in the depths of philosophy, in the intricate webs of thought he'd spun, but in the simplicity of existence itself, in the act of living fully, without fear of the end. With this, he stood at a crossroads, poised for a shift that would redefine him, that would strip away the man he'd been and forge something new in his place. For years, he'd hunted meaning in wealth, fame, and thought, only to find them barren, hollow shells that crumbled at his touch. He'd turned to history's giants, poets, historians, rationalists, hoping their wisdom would save him, would offer a lifeline to pull him from the depths, but it hadn't. It couldn't. He'd even teetered on oblivion, wondering if life was a jest with no punchline, a cruel game played by an indifferent cosmos. Yet his path had veered unexpectedly, a turn he hadn't foreseen. The answer he'd chased wasn't locked in theories or triumphs, wasn't buried in the pages of books or the accolades of men. It was alive in the world, waiting to be seen, waiting for him to open his eyes. The revelation was stark yet profound, a truth that cut through the noise. Meaning wasn't forged in the mind, but in the heart. Not in isolation, but in connection. Not in greatness, but in the ordinary, the everyday. Philosophers had tried to build meaning with logic, stacking arguments like bricks, but their towers crumbled under death's weight, fragile and fleeting. These people, traders, fighters, roamers, showed him something sturdier, something real. Their lives weren't about ambition, about carving their names into eternity, but about presence, duty to a craft that sustained them, love for a moment that warmed them, faith in the next step that carried them forward. They didn't analyze meaning, they embodied it, lived it in their bones, and in that, they held a peace he'd never known, a calm he'd never touched. Tolstoy realized he'd been chasing a phantom, a ghost of certainty that slipped through his grasp. Meaning wasn't a prize to seize, but a reality to inhabit, a truth to step into. This truth remade him, reshaped him from the inside out. He shed the belief that his works could defy time, that his name could outrun death's reach. He no longer saw himself as a solitary genius, crafting purpose from nothing, a lone creator against the void. He was part of a vast, flawed, beautiful whole, a thread in a tapestry larger than himself. Life wasn't a quest for glory, a race to the top, but a chance to give, to connect, to endure through the storms. He turned from the hollow pursuits that had once ruled him, recognition, pride, comfort, and sought something truer, something deeper. In his later years, he wrote with new fire, stripping existence to its bones, questioning power with a fierceness that startled his peers, championing the small, the overlooked, the real. He clashed with the mighty, church, state, critics, choosing raw honesty over their gilded lies, their fragile illusions. He lived simply in those final years, not as a noble cloaked in privilege, but as a man among men, giving voice to the voiceless, seeking a peace he'd once thought impossible, a peace he'd once believed was beyond his grasp. Death ceased to be a specter, a thief in the night. It was a passage, not a theft, a chapter's close rather than a story's end. Through the lives of those he'd once overlooked, through the merchants and soldiers and wanderers who'd shown him the way, he found what he'd sought all along. Not a doctrine carved in stone, not a final answer to silence all questions, but a way to live that made the question bearable, that turned it from a burden into a companion. His journey speaks to our deepest yearnings, to the fears and longings that pulse beneath our own lives, suggesting that meaning isn't a chase, isn't a distant prize. It's here, in the quiet, in the shared, in the simple act of being, of breathing, of moving forward. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more.